We're going to be doing part 2 of our Love Incarnate series, and we have a treat today. You might know that there's about 50 of us in January who are going to the land of Israel. And we've done this trip once before, and our tour guide has been here this weekend preparing the people who are going for the trip. We sort of had a crash course in archaeology and the entire history of the land of Israel yesterday. And we've asked him to come and to preach in our services today. And just so you know a little bit about him, Benj Foreman is connected to our church through Curtis Lewis. Him and Curtis were at IBEX together a couple decades ago. And after going to IBEX, Benj fell in love with the land of Israel and with somebody from the land of Israel. He met his wife, Yael, there in Israel, and they got married. And he went and he studied. He got his master's degree in Old Testament studies from Hebrew University in Israel, and then got his PhD at Aberdeen in Scotland, and then went back and was at IBEX. He lived in the land of Israel for 15 years, and now he hosts he hosts our group that goes and he offers tours of Israel. And he's going to be bringing the word to you today. So can you welcome as he comes?
Thank you. So nice to see you guys. As I said in the first service, it's really nice to see some familiar faces from the last trip. If you raise your hand if you were in the last trip. Okay, a couple back there. Good. Well, we're really excited. I had such a good time with you last time that I was so thrilled when Curtis and Pastor Caleb said, "Hey, we want to go again." I'm like, "Yes, let's go. Let's get you to Israel and hopefully, get you excited about seeing the Bible or about reading the Bible in the land of the Bible." Now, as Pastor Caleb said, I kind of come from an education background. I was a college professor for the better of 15 years or so, and so I figured I'd start with a quiz. It's just part of my DNA, so it's just one question, though. My students did, I've heard some rumblings. A lot of my students in the past said that I was kind of a tough teacher, so I'll let you be the judge of that. Here's just the one question, okay? Try and see if you can answer this one on your own. Why is Christmas on December 25th? So there's 7 possible answers that I have. A, late Roman sources suggest that this was the actual day that Jesus was born. Just hold it to yourself here. Hold on. B, December 25th was a pagan holiday for sun worship. Christians changed the festival to a celebration of Jesus' birth to avoid worshiping the sun. C, early Christians connected Jesus' conception and birth with Passover. D, medieval Christians believed Jesus, the light of the world, must have been born on the darkest day of the year, namely the winter solstice. E, A and C. F, B and D, or D, throw your hands up, none of the above. Any thoughts? Anybody answer A? No? B? Okay, a couple B's. C? D? E? F, G, anybody like, I don't know what you're talking about. It's too early. The answer actually probably surprises you a little bit. The answer actually is E, A and C. And let me flesh that out a little bit, because I know some of you probably were thinking C, right? I threw that in there to try and, some of you probably be thinking B. And I threw that in there to try and trip you up just a little bit. Thinking about Jesus' birth was not something that the early church even really thought about. Okay, so you think about, let me ask you this question. Here's an easier question. On which day did Jesus die? Passover, right? We all know that, and Christians even in Jesus' day believe that and recognize that, and then in the decades after that, they even celebrated that. In fact, there was sort of a little festival, probably, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, you don't have to turn there, but Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5, let us celebrate the Passover. Christ is our Passover lamb, and let us therefore celebrate that festival, the Passover lamb, the death and resurrection of Jesus, with the leaven of malice, without the leaven of malice and evil. So even in Jesus' day and in the decades following, they recognized when Jesus died. They celebrated that. But when was Jesus born? That wasn't a question that really was on the forefront of many people's minds. And in 200 AD, so 170 years or so after Jesus' resurrection, Christians started thinking that. So that's the late Roman period, actually. So there's a Roman author, or a Christian writer, I should say. His name is Clement of Alexandria. And he writes this. He says, some have not only determined the year of our Lord's birth, but also the day. And they say that it took place in the 28th year of Augustus, and on the 25th day of the Egyptian month Pachon, which would be May 20th of our calendar. So he says some say Jesus was born on May 20th. And then he continues, he says, others, though, say that Jesus was born on April 20th or 21st. So even 170 years after Jesus' resurrection, the day of his birth wasn't quite settled yet, but people were starting to think about that. So which is the correct date? The Bible actually doesn't give us very many clues, right? When you think of the story of Jesus' birth, Luke tells us that there were shepherds out in the fields keeping watch over their flocks by night. So some have thought, okay, maybe that means that was the springtime, because the shepherds were sort of watching over their flocks at night. It's the lambing season, so the sheep were giving birth, and so they're kind of there to facilitate that. Possibly, but shepherds are kind of out in the fields all the time, honestly. Even today, you go to Israel today, you see shepherds kind of out year-round out in the field. So not a clear indication there. There's not much in the Bible, actually, that tells us when Jesus was born. But there are actually two days in our culture today that are celebrated for Christmas. So the first one all of us know, December 25th, which, by the way, is when my wife was born. Christmas baby. And the second, anybody know when the second day was? Or is, I guess? Actually, January 6th. Okay, so if you've ever been to Russia or Ukraine, kind of countries where the Russian Orthodox Church or even the Greek Orthodox Church has a strong presence, they celebrate Christmas on January 6th. Okay, you ever heard that before? And the reason is, or the question is, why? Why these 2 days? Why December 25th and January 6th? The popular kind of explanation is that, there was this sun worship, the worship of a sun god Saturnalia, or the Russian or the Roman festival of the sun god Sol, and it happened to fall on December 25th, and so Christians changed it so that you're not worshiping the sun, but you're worshiping God. It's sort of like at Halloween, we change. Kind of as Christians, we kind of don't make it a Halloween, the Day of the Witches. We make it, the Harvest Festival. Kind of we switch it. We kind of make it kind of more palatable for Christians. That's one common explanation. The problem, though, is that we don't have any firm evidence for that. And in fact, we have evidence that December 25th was celebrated as the day of Jesus' birth even before the Romans worshipped the sun god on December 25th. So in 222, for example, there's a Christian author called Hippolytus, and he says that Jesus was born on December 25th, even before there was any kind of sun worship connected to that day. So that still doesn't answer the question then. Why do we worship? Why do we say Jesus was born on December 25th? And the reason is that the early Christians actually connected the conception of Jesus with the death of Jesus, with Passover. Okay, so the conception of Jesus, when Mary became pregnant. There's a writer called Tertullian of Carthage. He's a Christian writer. He did some calculations in 200 AD. And he calculated that the day of Jesus' crucifixion, namely Passover, right? Jesus born on Passover. The day of Jesus' crucifixion, in the year that he was born, was March 25th. Okay, that's according to his calculations. So because Christians said that the same day, not the same year, but the same day that Jesus died was the same day that Jesus was conceived, how long does it take for a baby to be born? 9 months. So March 25th is Passover, so they say, okay, that was the day of his conception. 9 months later, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December 25th. That's how they arrived at the birth of Jesus, because they connected the conception with Jesus' conception with the day that he died. Others had slightly different calculations, and so they calculated that that Passover in the year that Jesus was crucified was on April 6th. And so, you do the calculation, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December, January 6th. That's why the Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox, celebrate Christmas on January 6th. So there's actually 12 days between those 2 days, December 25th, January 6th, and that's how we get the 12 days of Christmas, right? On the first day of Christmas, my true love gave to me, blah, blah, blah. You know the story, or the song. And so what's the point in all that? I think it's interesting that early Christians made that connection. And I found this picture here that's painted by an Armenian painter, and this is much later. So all throughout time, in the late Roman period, all the way up into the medieval period, Christians connected the birth of Jesus with the death of Jesus, the conception of Jesus with the death of Jesus. And I thought this painting was interesting because if you look here, kind of on the lower right-hand corner, there's Joseph. He's disconnected from Jesus, from everything connected to Jesus' birth because he's not his natural father. And then you have the angels up at the top making the announcement to the shepherds, and you have the wise men to the left. What I thought was interesting about this picture, though, is look at the manger that Jesus is placed in. It looks like a different kind of a manger, doesn't it? What is it? What is he actually laying on? It's an altar. It's actually an altar. And the point is that the point that the painter is trying to make is it's a foreshadow of what Jesus came to do. What did Jesus come to do? To be sacrificed, to die. And I think that's a really interesting concept. I wouldn't go so far, obviously, as to say that, the day Jesus died was the same day that he was conceived. We don't know that. Nothing says that in the Bible. Possibly, but we don't know. What is interesting, though, it's a good reminder that Jesus came to earth in order to die. And early Christians made that connection, right? The point of Jesus' coming was in order to fulfill the work of the Father by dying for us, by redeeming humanity, right? Jesus came in order to die. And the topic for today's message is how did Jesus love the Father with all of his heart and all of his soul? I think that's an interesting question, as I was thinking about that, because we normally think of Jesus' love for us, right? Think of the different children's songs that you know. 1, 2, 3, Jesus loves me. 1 and 2, he loves you too, right? Or Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Or Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. And that's true, obviously. Jesus loves you and me. Jesus says, John chapter 13, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. So you are to love one another. So certainly Jesus loves us. But Jesus also loved the Father. And several verses later in John, Jesus says this in John chapter 14, verse 31. I do as the Father has commanded me, so that the world may know that I love the Father. And I think this verse really answers that question. How did Jesus love the Father with all of his heart? By doing as the Father has commanded him. And notice the connection there. He says, I do the work that the Father has commanded me, so that the world may know that I love the Father. So doing is connected to loving. Or we'll flip it around. Loving is translated into doing. And that really is the basis for the message today. Or to put another verse that I have here, this is a trustworthy saying that is deserving of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world in order to save sinners. So again, there it is. Why did Jesus come into the world? In order to save sinners. And by saving sinners, Jesus shows us that he loves the Father. And that's well, another verse. I want to get to my next slide here. As the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 10, Jesus came in order to do the work of the Father. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sins offerings you have not taken pleasure. And then I said, I have come to do your will, as it is written of me in the book of the scroll. So really the basis for the message is this. Jesus displays his love for the Father by doing the work that the Father gave him. Okay, he shows us that he loved the Father by doing the work that the Father gave him. And then the question arises, well, what's the work that the Father gave him? The main work is to save sinners. The work the Father gave Jesus to do was save sinners by dying. Now, in this series over the next couple of weeks, you'll probably hear a number of messages that kind of flesh that out. How did Jesus love God with all of his heart, with all his soul, with all of his mind, with all of his strength? What I want to do in this message is take a slightly different angle and say, in light of this, in light of the fact that Jesus loves the Father, and he shows us that he loves the Father by doing the work of the Father, how did that actually affect his life? What effect did that have on Jesus? Or put differently, what are the kind of three consequences of obeying or of loving the Father? Okay, so I have three kind of points here for you. Number one, obeying the Father led to Jesus being incredibly humbled. Okay, obeying the Father, coming to earth, doing the work that the Father had for him, led to him being incredibly humbled. Now let's not forget who Jesus is. Okay, we think of Jesus in the manger, cute little baby, he grows up, he's a great teacher, he's got a good following. All of that is true, but Jesus is much more than that. He's not just a Galilean rabbi. Who is he? He's actually God come in the flesh. And so I want to kind of flesh that out a little bit and remind ourselves that Jesus is actually God come in the flesh. And sometimes we think, of, there's a few passages maybe in the New Testament that talk about the deity of Christ. John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Certainly that's a passage that speaks of Jesus' deity, but there's many more passages. The entire New Testament speaks about the deity of Jesus. And what I want to do here is just highlight a couple examples from the Christmas story. Probably a couple examples you haven't seen before, and since it's the Christmas season, I figured let's have a look at a couple passages from Luke and in Matthew. So look at Luke chapter 1. If you have your Bible, if you want to look there with me. Look at Luke chapter 1, verse 16. The story of Jesus' birth in Luke actually begins with the birth, not of Jesus, but of John the Baptist. Why? Because John the Baptist is the forerunner to Jesus. And look at what the angel says to Zechariah. Remember the story. Zechariah and Elizabeth are old, advanced in age, and they don't have any children. So the angel appears to Zechariah when he's in the temple, and he says, your wife is going to give birth to a son. And here's what the angel says about this son, John the Baptist. Luke 1:16. He says, he, John the Baptist, will turn many of the children of Israel to whom? What does it say there? To the Lord, their God. Okay, so he's going to turn the hearts of the people to God, and he, verse 17, John the Baptist, will go before him. Who's the him pointing to? God, right? He, John the Baptist, is going to go before God in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children. So here you have the angel saying that, look, John the Baptist is going to be a forerunner to the coming of God himself. God is going to come, and he's going to point to this Messiah who's going to be a divine Messiah. And then look what, remember the story, Zechariah doesn't really believe, and he can't talk for a while. John the Baptist is born, and his mouth is opened, and then the first thing that he does is he utters this psalm of praise. And look at Luke chapter 1, verse 17. Look at what Zechariah says. Sorry, Luke 1:76, sorry. Luke 1:76. He says, you, my child, John the Baptist, you will be called the prophet of the Most High. And you will go before the Lord, there it is again, God, to prepare his ways. Now, I think that's an interesting passage. So John the Baptist comes before the Lord and prepares the way for the coming of God. Remember what the Pharisees, when the Pharisees asked John the Baptist in John chapter 1, who are you? Remember, he's out in the wilderness, he's preaching. They say, who are you? Are you Elijah? Are you Jeremiah? Are you one of the other prophets? What does Zechariah respond? What does he say? He says, I am the voice of one, remember that passage? Crying out in the wilderness. Remember that passage? And what he does actually is he quotes from the Old Testament. You can turn there if you like, but you can listen if you like. He's actually quoting from Isaiah chapter 40. John the Baptist is the voice of one crying in the wilderness. This is what Isaiah had said. There's a voice, Isaiah 40 verse 3. A voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of, and there it is again, God, Yahweh, the Lord, to make straight in the desert a highway for our God. And then he says in verse 5 of that passage, the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all of flesh will see it together. So this voice of one crying in the wilderness is preparing the way for God, and everybody is going to see the glory of God. If you read the book of John, who is the glory of God? It's Jesus. And so people see Jesus. When they see Jesus, they see the glory of God. So in Luke, you have the angel saying, hey, this kid, John the Baptist, is a forerunner for the coming of God into earth. And then Zechariah says something even more, I think is something even more amazing. Look at Luke chapter 1, verse 78. In fact, I have it on the screen here. Ignore the arrow for just a second. Luke says that because of our God's tender mercy, because God loves us so much and so merciful, the dawn will break upon us from on high to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death to guide our feet into the way of peace. You ever read this passage before? What does Zechariah mean here when he says the dawn will break upon us from on high? Now that word that I've highlighted in red is actually a Greek word called, I got it on the screen here, it's a Greek word Anatole. Now the Greek word Anatole has two meanings to it. It means a light, which is why we have the word dawn here, that kind of comes up. Picture like a light, a flashlight, you can see the ray of light that shines up. That's the idea. That's Anatole in Greek. It's like a light shining up. Another meaning is a shoot. So if you cut down a tree and you let the you let it continue to grow, you have a little shoot that grows up from that stump, right? That's called a sucker, I think. So, but it's the same idea. You have these rays or a shoot that kind of rises up. That's this word, Anatole. Now, incidentally, that word, that Greek word, translates two Hebrew words in the Greek Septuagint. One of them is a star. So in Numbers chapter 24, you have a star that comes out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. The Greek translation of the Old Testament uses that same word. Now that passage is a messianic passage. Right? A star shall come out of Jacob. That passage in Numbers, it's Balaam's oracle. It speaks about the Messiah who's coming. And then in Zechariah, you have a branch, or in Hebrew it's semach. That same word is translated, Anatole translates that Hebrew word, a branch, a man whose name is branch is coming. And then later on in Zechariah it says that branch is a priest on a throne. It's a messianic passage. All of that gets, I know it's a lot. The point of all of this is that when Zechariah says, the dawn shall break upon us from on high, what Zechariah means is the Messiah. Okay, because that is a messianic metaphor. It's a metaphor for the Messiah. The light that's coming, it's like a light in the darkness, right? And that's the Messiah. Notice where that Messiah is coming from. From on high. Where is on high? In heaven. So the Messiah is coming down to earth from heaven, he says, and he's going to give light to those who sit in darkness in the shadow of peace, and he's going to guide our feet in the way of peace. Sound like a passage you know from the Old Testament? He's basically quoting from Isaiah chapter 9, where Isaiah says, the people have walked in darkness, suddenly they see a great light. And those who dwell in the shadow, in the land of darkness, on them a light has shone. And what is that light? It's actually a child. Later on, verse 6, a child is born, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. So you can summarize all of that by just a couple things. Number one, the angel Gabriel says that John the Baptist will go before God. Right? God is coming to his people, and John the Baptist is the forerunner to God. Zechariah says the same thing about John the Baptist. He will prepare the way of Yahweh. Yahweh is God's personal name. He will prepare the way of God. And the Messiah is a divine Messiah. He's going to come down from heaven. All of that, and Jesus hasn't even been born yet. Look at the account in Matthew. Let me highlight a couple points here from the birth of Jesus in Matthew. If you look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 19, Matthew tells us that Joseph wanted to divorce Mary. Why? Because she was with child, and so Joseph, knowing regular biology, thought that, Mary had been unfaithful. But the angel says in verse 20, as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. So let's not forget that Jesus has no earthly father. He actually is the Son of God. So when Matthew, throughout the book, talks about Jesus as the Son of God, he very physically is the Son of God. The Holy Spirit is what made Mary pregnant. I have an earthly father. Jesus had no earthly father. So he was actually the descendant of God. He's the Son of God. And then look at what he says in the next verse. This child will Mary will bear a son, and you will call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Now in English, we kind of miss it. Jesus, saved from their sins. You don't hear the connection, but in Hebrew, it's the same word. His name will be Yeshua, because in him there is Yeshua. You could say his name will be Salvador, because in him there is salvation. Right? That would be maybe like a better analogy. So it's really clear in English, or in Hebrew, that his name is Jesus, because in him there is salvation. Now, in the Old Testament, and in Jewish culture in general, names are significant. So picture Jacob. Right? Why was Jacob called Jacob in the Old Testament? Because remember, he held on to the heel of his brother Esau. And the word for heel in Hebrew is Jacob, Yaakov. It's the same word. So because he holds the heel, he's called heel. Or why is he later renamed Israel? Because he wrestled with God. Remember in Genesis chapter 33? What does the word Israel mean? To wrestle with God. So names have a significance in the Bible, and the same is true with Jesus. He's called Jesus salvation because in him there is salvation, but Matthew goes beyond that. Look at verse 22 in Matthew 1. He says, "This took place in order to fulfill what the Lord has spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us." Now, I was reading this passage in Israel years ago. And so in Israel, we speak Hebrew. So people read the New Testament in Hebrew, right? So it's a translation of the Greek New Testament into Hebrew. And what I noticed something really interesting. In this passage, in the translation that I was reading, that little bit there in red, which means God with us, wasn't in the Hebrew translation of the New Testament. I thought, why is it not in there? Well, the reason they left it out is because everybody knows what Emmanuel means. Emmanuel means Emmanuel, with us, God. It'd be like saying, what does Facebook mean? Waste of time. No, just kidding. It means, amen, yeah. Facebook is a book of faces. It would be kind of weird, and so they called they called it Facebook because it's a book of faces. You kind of know what it means. Those are the words. What's interesting though is that it's in the Greek, and Matthew thought that it was significant enough for the readers to understand what that name means that he even translated it. Why? Because he wanted you to know that Jesus' name is significant. He's called Emmanuel because in him, God is with us. And you see that, all of this, just in the birth of Jesus. So the point of all of this, again, I could go on and on and on. The point of all of this is that the Bible makes it really clear that Jesus is God with us. Jesus is God, and so his coming to earth to do the will of the Father was an incredible act of humility. Now, maybe if you talk to people on the street, they say, oh, that was something that was invented later by the Christians. So, there's a book, The Da Vinci Code. I don't know if you've ever read it. But there's a passage there's a little section in the Da Vinci Code where the author, Dan Brown, tries to make the point that, before the Nicene Council in 325 A.D., so 300 years after Jesus, nobody thought Jesus was God until 300 years after. And he says, there's this little exchange between a professor, who's discovered this kind of amazing thing about the Bible that nobody knew. And he says, at the Nicene Council, the Christians debated the divinity of Jesus. And the student says, Sophie is her name, she says, you're saying the divinity of Jesus was the result of a vote? And he says, a relatively close vote at that. Until that moment, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a man, a mortal. Not only is that wrong, it's embarrassing because we have plenty of passages from the first century even, that Christian writers are saying Jesus is God come in the flesh. So this guy, Ignatius of Antioch, born in 30 A.D., so in 50 A.D., he's 20 years old, living in Antioch. Can you think of anybody that went to Antioch? Paul, right? I wonder where he got this idea. Probably talking to Paul. He says this. He says, there's only one physician who is possessed both of flesh and spirit, who is both made and not made, God existing in the flesh, even Jesus Christ our Lord. And I could go on and on. There's more and more examples of this. Even pagans recognized that Christians worshipped Jesus as God. So this guy Pliny the Younger, who's writing to the Emperor Trajan in Rome, he says, the Christians meet together and they sing an anthem to Christ as God. The point of all of this is that Jesus is God come in the flesh. People recognize that early on. It's in the Bible. We have extra biblical texts which show that Christians worship Jesus as God. And if that's the case, then Jesus coming to earth to do the will of the Father was an incredible act of humility. And Paul fleshes that out in Philippians chapter 2. He says, look, if you guys want to be humble, remember how Jesus humbled himself. Have this attitude among yourselves, which is in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality of God a thing to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, taking on the form of a servant. And he humbled himself. He became human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So Jesus loved the Father by doing the work that God gave him to do. And in doing that, he displayed incredible humility. The second consequence of loving the Father is obeying the Father, or loving the Father, led to Jesus enduring incredible injustice. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, somebody knocks on your door and they say, it's the police. You're like kind of in a confusion. They come into your bed, they handcuff you, they take you off to jail. They say, you're arrested for armed robbery. What are you talking about? I don't even own a gun. Armed robbery? You go to jail like, okay, everything will get worked out, but things just go from bad to worse. They mistreat you in the jail. There's witnesses all of a sudden that arise out of nowhere, and they're like, oh yeah, we saw him at the 7-Eleven. He was holding the gun and he was, threatening the clerk. Like, what are you talking about? And their stories don't match up, but the judge is like, yeah, okay, we'll let it stand. You get sent off to court. The jury hears all of these testimonies. None of them make sense. And you're like, what? They're not the same. They're not even saying that I wore the same clothes or it was even the same day. Their testimonies don't line up. And yet the jury says, guilty, 12 years in jail. You would feel like that is an incredible act of injustice. In Jesus' case, it was even worse. Because not only did Jesus not commit the specific crime that they accused him of, insurrection, Jesus didn't even sin. Right? Jesus did nothing wrong. And the thieves on the cross recognized that. In Luke chapter 23, one thief says to the other thief, we're receiving the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. He's being crucified for not doing anything wrong. Or Paul, reflecting on Jesus, says that God made him, Jesus, to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Pilate recognized that Jesus did nothing wrong. 4 different times when Jesus appears before Pilate in Luke chapter 23, Pilate says, this man has done nothing worthy of death. And yet what does he do? He signs the death warrant and sends him off to be crucified. So what's shocking about that is that justice is one of God's signature virtues. The Roman gods were not just, right? They were unpredictable. In contrast, God, the God, is just. Deuteronomy chapter 32, for example, says, the rock, his work is perfect, for all of his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity. Just and upright is he. Or Isaiah chapter 30, for the Lord our God is a God of justice. Blessed are all who wait for him. So Jesus, the person who embodies justice, was himself treated unjustly. And then number 3, obeying the Father led to Jesus experiencing incredible suffering. Let's not forget how Jesus dies. He doesn't die in his sleep, right? He actually dies a death which is quite violent and horrible. The Romans actually ranked different ways of dying. In their mind, the best way to die, or the least violent way of dying, was by decollation, decapitation. If you're decapitated, that's kind of the easiest way to go. It's really quick and you don't really feel it. I did think it was interesting in doing a little research They also said you could substitute decapitation with throwing the criminal to the wild animals, and they could just devour them. So the lion, I guess, is just as easy, I guess, an easy death. I think I'd take decapitation over death by lion crunching. A worse way of dying, though, by either decapitation or lion munching, is cremation. So being burned is a worse way of dying, right? So they said, decapitation, burning, but the worst form of death is crucifixion. It's even worse than burning, they said. For the Romans, crucifixion was reserved for slaves and violent criminals. So Cicero says that crucifixion is the summum supplicium, he says in Latin, the most extreme form of punishment. Josephus, who's a Jewish writer from about the end of the 1st century AD, he says, crucifixion is the most wretched of deaths. And then Cicero says, not only should crucifixion not be for Roman citizens, the very word cross should be removed from a Roman's thoughts, from a Roman's eyes, and a Roman's ears. For it is not only the actual occurrence of these things, but the very mention of them that is unworthy of a Roman citizen. So a Roman citizen not only shouldn't be crucified, they shouldn't even talk about crucifixion in the presence of a Roman citizen. And yet that's how Jesus died. Could he have called it off? Of course, right? He could have struck people with blindness, but he didn't. He chose to endure the cross, like Hebrews says, right? He despised the shame, endured from sinners hostility against himself. So how did Jesus love the Father with all of his heart? By doing the work that the Father sent him to do. And doing that work led to Jesus experiencing great humility. He's God who humbles himself as a man. It led to Jesus enduring great injustice and great suffering. And I think that, is a question that we need to think about. Well, what about us? Isn't Jesus an example for us? We should love the Lord our God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. That's what Jesus tells the Pharisees when they say, hey, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Now, my guess is probably many of us in this room would say, yeah, I love God with all my heart, with all my soul. But how is that how strong will that love be when the going gets tough? Are you ready to love God with all of your heart, even if it results in you being humbled in some way? Sometimes it's so easy for us to just kind of wimp out. Like, oh, they made fun of me at school, so I didn't stand up for Jesus. Or my coworkers, they kind of laugh at me. They humble me a little bit. Are you willing to love God with all your heart, even if it results in you being humbled, people looking down on you in some way, your friends laughing at you at school, or some other way? Are you ready to love God with all of your heart, even if it results in you being treated unjustly? In America, we're used to justice. Christians, generally speaking, are treated justly, more or less. In Israel, not so much the case. Christians, are not always treated according to the letter of the law. There was, some friends of ours, they found out that they were Christians, and his wife was trying to get citizenship, and they said, no, we're not going to give it to you because you believe in Jesus. Well, that's against the law, but we don't care about the law. So they had to get a lawyer, and it went to court. Long ordeal because they were Christians. And the same thing might, one day be the case here in America. Our culture is being secularized. And, right now we enjoy the freedoms and sort of the same justice, but that might not be the case. Perhaps there might be freedom of religion in America so long as your religion doesn't go against the accepted norms of society. What society has to say about gay marriage, what society has to say about abortion, what society has to say about social justice. Are we as Christians ready to love God with all of our heart, even if it results in us one day being treated unjustly? Or are we ready to love God with all of our heart, even if it results in us being physically persecuted in some way? For us, it's kind of almost theoretical. Physical persecution, I mean, when do we experience that in Lancaster? Or are we in Palmdale? Both. Right? When do we experience that? Probably not so much, or in Boise, Idaho, where I live. But around the world, lots of Christians experience persecution. We get a little magazine called The Voice of the Martyrs. And I was reading a couple examples of some Christians that are persecuted for their faith today. So Pastor Natya, who's in India, him and his 16-year-old son were attacked with axes, sticks, and other tools simply for believing in Jesus. Or in Nigeria, there were some Muslim militants who attacked Pastor Ibrahim Isa on the morning of April 15th of this year. So he's walking home, they attack him, he tried to run away, they shot him, and he ended up dying. Killed for his faith. And there's literally thousands and thousands of those examples. Now, I don't like to, think about those kind of stories. I kind of like having a comfortable life. But God didn't call us to a comfortable life. We shouldn't seek persecution, but when persecution does come, let's remain faithful to God. Right? Let's love God with all of our heart. Jesus did that, and it resulted in him dying. Are we ready to do the same thing? James says in James chapter 1, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." So may God give us the strength to remain faithful to him, even under trials. Amen? Amen. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word and how it speaks to us. Thank you for the example that you gave us of loving God with all of your heart, even to the point of suffering humility, injustice, persecution. Lord, I just pray that you would help us to be strong in our faith in everything that we do. In Jesus' name.